The Nyss were always a tradition-bound people, even compared to us Iosans, and even when they were Iosan themselves. Nearly all aspects of their very existence have been tied to some ritual or other, and that includes objects or possessions associated with those rituals. Part of this adherence to religious forms dates back as far as the Cataclysm and the subsequent founding of the Iosan nation in the Mistbound Alkenbau forests. But it took an almost paranoid superstitious slant when the Divine Court left on their ill-fated voyage back to the Veld. This is an attitude which persisted through the exodus led by Eric into the current time and past the Sundering when the Elven race was irreversibly fractured. Perhaps understandably, this clinging to ancient forms despite other changes has only become more intense because of these recent events. The most indicative and characteristic part of Nyss culture, which represents this aspect of their cultural identity over the millennia, is, at least in my opinion, the Nyss Claymore. Nothing demonstrates this more than the average encounter with a Nyss sellsword, and being advised their melee weapon of choice, which they carry on their back, is a claymore, even though it resembles a backsword like a Scorn katana more than any double-edged claymore of Signarin or even Khadoran heritage. The Nyss Claymore has seen a great deal of change over the generations of their existence, as a weapon wielded by the Nyss warriors and soldiers, even though the name has remained unchanged in all that time. Based on what fragments of preserved archival lore which still exist from the ancient days of the Empire of Laos, the Nyss Claymore finds its origins in the mythical forge of Nisor, the sire of winter. Voas was the divine greatsword wielded by the craftsman of the gods, while he forged straight-bladed weapons for his servants to carry. Because of this, Laosan weaponsmiths paid homage to their patron by crafting different blades for different purposes. Thus, the prized greatswords wielded by the protectors of temples dedicated to Nisor would be the mortal analogue to Voas, and could be held above the weapon of the normal Nyss soldier. Where the greatsword, curved, single-edged, and with a circular guard, was wielded by and for the immortal, a new sword, straight, double-edged, with a quillon, would then be wielded by and for the mortal. Quite when the first claymores were produced or what their precise design was are details lost to history, but later examples of the weapon survived to be carried to the Mistbow after the Cataclysm. Up until this point, claymores had changed little, except in level of refinement and ornateness. For the most part, during the last days of the Empire of Laos, the claymore had been just as much a ceremonial weapon, used and displayed during both secular and religious events as a combat weapon, wielded by the hand-picked bodyguards to nobles who swore fealty to Nisor first among the Divine Court, as well as those elves who worshipped that same god with greatest piety and zeal. As such, they were often just as heavy as greatswords despite being shorter weapons. Those Nyss chosen to carry them in ceremonies prided themselves for being able to do so for anything up to hours at a time, as one of many signs of dedication to Nisor. This usage continued until the founding of Ios, when circumstances meant the weapon's form invariably saw steady change over the course of several centuries. Due to the initial lack of resources and the need to prioritize mere survival over ceremony, artisans and swordsmiths focused their effort on making functional swords. As a result, flourishes to the hilt, handle, and pommel were foregone in favour of simple crossguards. The blade shape became fully straight instead of the subtle curve which previously gave it a slight leaf-like shape, and the pommel became nothing more than a plain disc, only occasionally inscribed with dedications to Nisor. Even the finishing touches were relatively meagre, and blades merely looked sturdy with none of the burnished sheen which characterised their older ceremonial pieces. This left new claymores with a much more understated appearance compared to their predecessors, and though they certainly looked less pretty and even cheap to outsiders if they chanced upon one, no Nyss would not be proud to wield such a sword. Further change came when the Iosans became settled in their new homeland and could thus make a return to entertaining ideas like luxury and typically uncomplicated Nyss vanities. Once more, claymores became used for ritualistic purposes, and such blades quickly took on a form of their own. The first, and easiest as far as the crafting processes was concerned, was making the weapon single-edged. With time came more small changes and the claymore became increasingly asymmetrical, but nevertheless remained a straight-bladed weapon. In many respects, the claymore came to be a characteristic of the Nyss's increasing isolation and hawkishness towards the remainder of Ios. This ongoing evolution accelerated with their departure from Nissathil and migration towards the Shardspires. As with the original migration of the elves from Laos to Ios, the Nyss had to contend with a harsh new environment where the necessary materials to craft new swords were very limited, and even more so now. The substitution of locally sourced alternatives compelled adaptation to what was essentially a new kind of steel, leading to compromises during the smithing process to account for these limitations. Also, the more complex techniques used for crafting the greatswords of the Risavas order and the priesthood saw no significant variation, while claymores ended up needing to adopt some of these complexities. All this meant the Nyss Claymore adopted the curved backsword visual archetype familiar to modern eyes. Thus, contemporary examples of the Nyss Claymore resembled smaller versions of the Nyss greatsword, and any remnant vestige of the ancient claymore was lost with the sole exception of the leather wrappings around the handle and the weapon's weight. Distinct from other bladed weapons which one might handle in the Iron Kingdoms, and despite being seemingly comfortable to wield one-handed, the claymore was a relatively heavy sword, thanks to the wide spine and unique blade profile. Looking towards the generations to come, it is difficult to say if the Nyss weapons, whether greatswords or claymores, will be anything more than artifacts or relics, emblematic of elven decline, especially since Nyssor is dead and Voas not quite the same as it once was. Few Nyss master swordsmiths remain to continue their traditions and pass them on to potential successors, whether as they are, or if continued on their millennia-spanning evolution. With the fate of the elven race as a whole still far from clear, it remains to be seen what will come of the Nyss, and whether the claymore will remain to play a part in the future of their culture, no matter it be its final decline or much hoped for resurgence.